day, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Governance and Policy Podcast by the Edmund Smith Center, Singapore's first and only organization promoting pro-market values. The aim of this podcast is educational, to demonstrate the importance of economics, public policy ideas, and the humanities in general. I'm Joshua, and I'll be the host for today's episode. Today, we're joined by Mr. Julian Morris, who will speak on sustainable development. Julian was the co-founder and executive director of the International Policy Network, and is now a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation and director of innovation policy at the International Center for Law and Economics. Thank you for coming on today, Julian.
You're welcome. That's a pleasure.
So, as an opener, what are your thoughts towards the idea of sustainable development?
The concept of sustainable development is a little bit like motherhood and apple pie. So the idea is that you should use your resources today in such a way as not to inhibit the ability of future generations to be able to use resources likewise. I mean, don't harm future generations is a sort of general concept, I suppose. The question though is how to implement that, and many people view sustainable development as implying a need to set specific goals in terms of resource consumption, goals in terms of accessibility in the future. That is very challenging as a concept, because it implies you need to have a kind of some sort of global plan. But the evidence, fortunately, the evidence is that where you have good institutions, where you have property rights, the rule of law, and markets, economies and societies tend to be more sustainable than where you try and impose central plans. So if you look at economies where there has been attempts at central planning, generally they've been much less sustainable. I mean, the most extreme example would be something like the Soviet Union, where the planners in the 1930s, for example, diverted water from several rivers that were flowing into the Aral Sea in order to produce more cotton and other crops in Central Asia. As a result of that, the Aral Sea dried up, and all of the fishermen who'd previously been reliant on the Aral Sea as a source of their income suffered. Meanwhile, the lands that were overwatered from the water that was diverted became salinified and became much less productive. So this is a gratuitous example of the egregious consequences of attempting to centrally plan production. But there are many others that have stories could be told of similar nature.
Moving on, continuing on our topic of sustainable development. So you mentioned a negative example, which is the Soviet Union, but are there any positive, successful examples of sustainable development, either in the past or currently in the present, in our modern political climate?
Well, I think you've seen over the course of the past 150 years a dramatic increase in wealth, a dramatic increase in productivity that has been largely driven by innovations that have occurred in the context of essentially kind of market institutions. So where people own property, they have stronger incentives to reinvest in improving that property so that it's productive for them, so that it generates a better livelihood for them. They are able, if they own property, to obtain lower cost bank loans, which enables them to invest in other things that might improve their lot. So you've seen, starting really in the 18th century, you saw innovations in agriculture, for everything from Tull's drill to the development of new crop varieties, the development of in the late 19th, early 20th century of fertilizers, and the continued improvement of that, the development of better pesticides, and over the course of the 20th century, dramatic improvements in agricultural productivity. And perhaps the most kind of discrete example of this would be the work done by Norman Borlaug initially in Mexico, where this was sponsored by philanthropists. So the Rockefeller Fund, so money that ultimately came from oil, I suppose, was invested in developing much higher productivity wheat. So Norman Borlaug identified ways of producing wheat that were dwarf wheat, so that that much less of the resources that go into wheat production were going into the stalks and more into the flowering parts, the seed that are useful for consumption. And he developed that over a period of years in Mexico, and then similar applications were developed for rice and other crops. And as a result of these much higher yielding crops, worldwide production of basic cereals has more than quadrupled over the course of the past century, which means that, contrary to the fears that were widespread in the mid 20th century, we now have people are better fed than at any time in history, in spite of a much larger population. More than 7 billion people are being fed a much better diet than was the case. So that just on its own seems to be a good example of sustainable development, and there's not good evidence that much harm has resulted from this. Moreover, you see ongoing innovations occurring that result in better conservation practices. So over the course of the past 30 years, there's been a revolution in the production of or the way that the crop residues are managed. So historically, crop residues were the stems of crops were burnt. Nowadays, they're either disked, or increasingly they're mulched using herbicide, which means that much more of the nutrients that are in the crops get returned to the soil, and you get much lower levels of soil erosion. So right. The kind of the Dust Bowl that was a feature of the United States in the 1930s has basically gone, and it's gone because of the introduction, first of all, of disking, and then of herbicides as a way to deal with the crop residues.
So you've been speaking a lot about the role of innovation in sustainable development, how these changes, how these evolutions in these adaptations in the way we farm has helped sustainable development. But all this relies on innovation. How does the precautionary principle sort of conflict with that, or affect this innovation, or at least this entire subfield of sustainable development?
So the precautionary principle, in a sense, is the default response to risk that humans have. We're fearful of the possible consequences of something, and so we avoid doing it. Over centuries, we as societies, through various institutions, have managed to overcome that precaution by developing alternative ways to apportion risk. So if there is something that might be harmful, we have developed ways of testing to identify potential harms. And in the context, for example, of new products, we were able to test those new products in various ways, using chemicals or using animal models, and as a result, we're able to identify whether or not something actually is harmful, and then it can be rolled out. This is an alternative to the historic solution, which was, for example, kings would require one of their minions to taste some food for them, and if their minion died, they knew that it wasn't good. That's a risk apportionment measure, but it's extremely authoritarian and harmful to the person who's forced to be the tester. If you instead have a market transaction whereby people can be compensated for example, taking part in drug trials, then you're able to then people are able to assume the risk and be compensated for the consequences. It doesn't mean the consequences entirely go away, but each party has an incentive to manage those risks on their own, rather than have the risk imposed upon them. The precautionary principle basically comes along and says, well, we don't think that you should do something for the first time. I mean, it says that you don't do something if there is some scientific uncertainty. That's a very coarse interpretation of it. And there are many, many different definitions of the precaution principle. But at that most extreme, in the most extreme version, which says don't do something which might harm the environment or human health, basically says, well, don't do any testing. You just can't do it. You can't have any more innovation on this. A slightly less extreme version, it requires very, very, very high levels it raises the burden of proof enormously, which makes it very difficult to do new things. And the question is there real justification in raising the burden of proof to that level? And I think in many cases, no. So a good example is the role of biotechnology in agriculture, where there is good evidence that we've accumulated over about 40 years of studying and implementing new biotech derived crops that these are not harmful to human health, and good evidence that in most cases they are not harmful to the environment. Caution might be justified in certain circumstances. So, for example, where a crop that's being modified is very close to a wild variety that is being grown in a particular area, there may be justification in having a boundary that prevents the transmission of the crop outside. But the evidence is that even where biotech crops do transmit traits, those traits don't actually persist in the environment, because most introduced traits don't confer substantial benefits to wild varieties. They actually impose additional costs. It's costly to add a trait, especially a trait that requires, in the normal course of production, the application of additional chemicals. So, for example, herbicide-tolerant crops would not be benefited in the wild context if you don't have the herbicide, so that other wild varieties would outcompete them quite quickly. So that's the evidence. So the application of the precaution principle in the context of biotechnology has caused real problems. In 1999, 2000, the agreement of the biosafety protocol, for example, which imposes all sorts of restrictions on how biotech crops can be sold across borders, has resulted in a real dampening down of investment in new biotech crops. And a sad example of this is golden rice, which was a technology developed by Ingo Petricus in Switzerland, that provides that it encodes a gene for provitamin A in rice, which would enhance the vitamin A content of the rice that is then grown. That construct was created again about 20 years ago, a bit more than 20 years ago, and yet in that time, commercial varieties have very few commercial varieties have been developed, and the reason is that in order to comply with the biosafety protocol as it's been interpreted in various different countries, and specifically in the Philippines, where the International Rice Research Institute is based, the number of varieties of rice that encode that provitamin A gene have been highly limited. So they've basically been doing one test after another, separated by 6 months or a year, instead of going out and testing 30 or 40 different varieties at the same time to evaluate which ones would be most useful in terms of their applicability for the local agronomic circumstances. So especially the ability to grow the rice locally, and the utility of the rice to local people. And unless you can do lots of those experiments, you're not going to get a variety that is really desirable for people growing it and people consuming it. So the biosafety protocol, which is an instantiation of the precaution principle, has, I think, slowed up innovation there and caused, I think, great harm because of the many hundreds of thousands of people who would benefit, millions of people actually, who would benefit from a pro-vitamin A rice. Which just some context here, vitamin A deficiency is very widespread, especially in Africa and Asia, and it causes a range of problems, including widespread blindness. And if you could enable people to have better access to vitamin A from whatever means, and certainly supplements are one way of doing it, but if you can get it through the food automatically, then that's potentially hugely beneficial. So precaution principle has actually harmed people.
So moving forward, how do you think environmental NGOs, perhaps the companies or organizations that are trying to push for biotechnical or agricultural innovation, can deal with this sort of pushback against their policies and against their inventions? Because right now what you're describing is that they are pushing forward with, at the front line of such innovation, developing new crops and new innovations that could help people, but they're being shut down in terms of bureaucracy. So how do you think we can help propel these innovations, or at least support these efforts as they continue?
Well, I think there needs to be more support from outside of the companies. Companies are really going to be subject to regulations. They can certainly put forward their documentation of what they've done to test the products and so on. But their ability even to do that is constrained by the regulatory machinery. So if the regulations are really extreme, then companies simply won't have the incentive to develop new technologies. And you've seen this in a number of examples of companies just abandoning technologies because of their feeling that they're not likely to get things through the regulatory approval process, even though those technologies would have net benefits to society. I do think there are new technologies which have come on board more recently that pose even fewer potential risks than the traditional gene insertion methodology for biotechnology. So CRISPR-Cas9, which essentially enables you to edit genes. And so you're not inserting new genes, you're literally just switching certain genes on and off in the plant itself. I think that's so safe, at least in the agricultural biotechnology context, that it justifies being outside of the onerous restrictions that have been put in place through the biosafety protocol. And hopefully that will be the case in many jurisdictions. Unfortunately, the EU has ruled that gene-edited plants are subject to the same sorts of restrictions there. But I think there's an opportunity in Asia to say, look, CRISPR-Cas9 is a great thing. We're going to implement it, and we're going to get new crops that will help feed the world at higher levels and with fewer environmental consequences. So let's go for it.
Right.
But it does take civil society to make that case. I think more than business. There needs to be kind of widespread understanding of and support for these things, because ultimately politicians will respond to the fears of consumers and the fears of those who say these things might be harmful to the environment.
All right. Okay. Thank you for that. Well, personally, Julian, you've written a lot of books and a lot of literature on environmentalism. I mean, just the list of your works alone covers most of a Wikipedia page. Personally, what do you foresee is the biggest challenge environmentalism will face, or at least the biggest threat to the sustainability and welfare of our current environmental advocacy and the entire environmental movement?
Well, I think for the past 30 years, the environmental movement has been increasingly narrowly focused on climate change, which has distracted us from other, in many cases, more pressing environmental problems. So in Singapore, you suffer from air pollution that results from poor land management practices in Indonesia. I would assume that air pollution is a much more serious, pressing, urgent problem than climate change is. And yet, because of the distraction of climate change, environmentalists have not been focusing on the real underlying causes of the pollution problem, which is largely, I think, a problem caused by inadequate definition, enforcement, and ability to exchange property in land. I mean, you see around the world where farmers are able to own their land, they invest in improving that land. They tend not to engage in slash and burn agriculture because they want to ensure that the nutrients that are available to them from the soil are there for a long time. Whereas slash and burn, as we know, tends to produce some good nutrients for a couple of years and then it goes. So, you know, if one could persuade environmentalists to shift their focus away from these sort of big kind of global concerns that are probably not as bad as are made out, and if they are bad, are probably best dealt with through methods other than those that for the most part environmentalists are pushing, then, you know, I think the world will be a better place. But persuading the environmental movement to shift focus is a huge task. There are some that are doing it. There's Mike Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus founded a group called the Breakthrough Institute in the States, which was pretty much devoted to sort of modernizing in the environmental movement and focusing on innovation as a core driver of environmental improvement. And they're getting some traction. And you have other people like Bjorn Lomborg, who I think has been a voice for reason on many different environmental debates, especially climate change, but also many other areas. And these people, I think, have done a good job of raising awareness among the public that there is a different perspective. But environmental groups, unfortunately, for the most part, haven't adopted those more rational, innovation-oriented, free market-oriented approaches. They remain mostly focused on seeking to push more negative views. There are some older groups, I would add, though, that, for example, Trout Unlimited and groups like that, that have remained fairly focused on improving the prospects for species through better land management. So Trout Unlimited has been very involved in maintaining wetlands, for example, and maintaining areas that are important for fish and wildfowl in the United States. And there are groups like that also in the UK. What was called the Anglers Conservation Association was doing a very similar job and is still mostly doing a similar job in the UK. So there are some good groups out there. I don't say there aren't, and there are some parts of some other groups that are doing good work as well. I mean, I've worked in the past with Worldwide Fund for Nature that was focused on improving management practices for species in southern Africa, and there they had a program in the southern African states in South Africa, Namibia, Botswana. That was Mozambique and Zimbabwe. There was focus called Campfire, community management program for indigenous resources. And Campfire was a great program that was focused on enabling the local people to have more of a stake in the conservation of local resources. So, and basically they would get some of the compensation that came from people visiting the local areas to go hunting or to do ecotourism visits. And that, you know, by involving local people, you incentivize them then to improve the land rather than hunt species themselves, often close to extinction. And you saw, as a result of that, and as a result of the expansion of private wildlife management in sub-Saharan Africa, especially southern Africa, you've seen a resurgence in the number of elephants and rhinoceros in those areas. In contrast to the situation, for example, in East Africa, where for the most part, those species could not be owned privately and have been hunted almost to extinction in many places.
All right, thank you so much for that. Thanks for coming on to our show, Julian.
Welcome.
Thank you.